I've been a fan of Jim Carrey since I first saw him in the clubs. He has had a legendary career. He's got a new series on Showtime called Wow, we don't usually get to plug Showtime. That shows what an icon you are.
Jim Carrey didn't just play Andy Kaufman. He lost himself in the role. And what happened on set shocked everyone who saw it. When Dave Chappelle visited the set of Man on the Moon, he expected to meet Carrey, but instead met someone who refused to break character under any circumstances. What seemed like dedication quickly crossed into something far more extreme, with even Universal Pictures keeping footage hidden for years. So what really happened during that performance? And how far did Jim Carrey go to become Andy Kaufman?
It's about love being hit by lightning. You know, I mean, this is about a gentleman whose heart is so big and his approach is so authentic.
Join us as we reveal what Dave Chappelle recently revealed about Jim Carrey. The day Chappelle walked onto the wrong set. Dave Chappelle had idolized Jim Carrey. To him, Jim represented something specific to a generation of comedians who had watched him in the early 90s. The proof that a certain kind of uncontrolled, full-body, boundary-dissolving comedy could be the thing that made you the biggest star in the world, rather than the thing that kept you out of the room. Dave was eager to meet. However, he had no idea what he was walking into. Dave's visit to the Man on the Moon, set in 1999, was arranged by Norm Macdonald, the late comedian who was one of the great connectors in the comedy world of that era. He walked in and shouted Jim Carrey's name, but he was met with silence. Every crew member immediately told him it was wrong. The man he had come to meet came over and behaved in a way that seemed strange. At the time, he had no idea he wasn't talking to Jim Carrey at all. He was talking to Andy Kaufman, as embodied and inhabited by a man who had decided there was no version of this film that involved ever stepping outside the character, for any reason. The crew had already adapted to this. They called him Andy because he asked them to. They had built their entire working relationship around a premise that was functionally indistinguishable from the premise that Jim Carrey no longer existed on the set of his own movie. Dave spent the afternoon in the presence of one of the greatest actors of his generation and never got to meet him. Looking back, Dave was characteristically generous about what he had witnessed. In hindsight, how lucky am I that I got to see one of the greatest artists of my time immersed in one of the most challenging processes ever, he said in the special. That assessment is sincere, and it is followed immediately by the punchline that detonated across the media and late-night discussions for weeks. The Jim Carrey story was the delivery mechanism for a joke about trans people. The structure of the joke, Dave's claim that having to accept that Jim Carrey is Andy Kaufman when he could clearly see it was Jim Carrey, is how trans people make him feel, instantly drew a sharp line between gender identity and what he framed as an obvious biological reality. The joke is the reason the special became a cultural event, rather than simply a Netflix comedy release. But the Jim Carrey story, on its own, is worth understanding. Because what was actually happening on that set is considerably more disturbing than a famous comedian staying in character. Dave saw something genuinely strange that afternoon and initially dismissed it as disappointing, later seeing it as evidence of extraordinary artistry. What he did not see, because it happened over months of filming and he was only there for one afternoon, is the full scope of what Jim Carrey did to himself in the process of becoming Andy Kaufman. What exactly happened on the Man on the Moon set? And why did Universal Pictures spend 18 years making sure the public never saw it?
Hello, I am Jimmy Carter, the President of the United States.
What Universal did not want you to see. The Man on the Moon filming ran through 1998 and 1999. Jim Carrey had been cast as Andy Kaufman in a biopic directed by Milos Forman. And before filming began, Jim made a decision that the production team would spend the next several months regretting. He would not be Jim Carrey for the duration of filming. He made this decision and communicated it, then held to it with an intensity that the documentary footage, shot over the course of production by Kaufman's former girlfriend, Lynn Margulies, captures somewhere between fascinating and genuinely alarming. Universal Pictures held that footage for nearly 20 years. Jim himself explained the reason. The studio suppressed it because they did not want the public to think Jim was an asshole. The footage was eventually released as the Netflix documentary Jim and Andy: The Great Beyond in 2017, produced by Spike Jonze. What it shows is a man who had made a complete and total commitment to a psychological experiment that nobody around him had fully anticipated would go as far as it went. The crew called him Andy because he demanded it. Milos Forman, one of the most respected directors in cinema history, could not get his lead actor to acknowledge his own name. When the camera cut, nothing changed. When lunch was called, nothing changed. When someone on the production tried to break through the performance to address the actual human being inside it, the actual human being had apparently decided not to be available. The footage shows Jim doing things that are uncomfortable to watch precisely because they are so earnest. He blasted ear-splitting music in the makeup trailer, in character as Tony Clifton, Kaufman's boorish, aggressive, lounge act alter ego. He provoked the people around him in ways specific to Kaufman's documented history of provocation, importing the behavior of a man who had been dead for 15 years into the daily working environment of a movie production in 1998. His co-workers actually feared the arrival of Tony Clifton, the Kaufman character Jim also embodied, because the behavior associated with that persona was so genuinely unpleasant that multiple crew members reportedly said out loud they did not want Tony to come back. The most dramatic incident involved professional wrestler Jerry Lawler, who had a real, documented history of antagonism toward Andy Kaufman in the early 1980s. Jim reproduced that antagonism on the set of the biopic with genuine physical commitment. He provoked Jerry in the way Kaufman had provoked him, and Jerry responded by pulling Jim's hair and locking him in a sleeper hold. Jim had also spat in Jerry's face prior to the physical altercation. The result was that Jim was hospitalized with 4 compressed vertebrae. He had gone so far inside the character of a man who had deliberately gotten himself beaten up by a professional wrestler as a piece of performance art that he reproduced the beating. He did not choreograph the beating. He provoked it into happening to him in real life, the way Kaufman had provoked real consequences as part of his own ongoing experiment with where the line between performance and reality actually sat. The difference was that Kaufman knew he was doing it as a bit. Whether Jim did is a question the documentary does not fully resolve. Jim was hospitalized with 4 compressed vertebrae from provoking a real professional wrestler, refused to answer to his own name for months, and had footage suppressed by a major studio because it made him look unhinged. And then, when the documentary finally came out in 2017, the things he said about the experience were in some ways more disturbing than anything the footage showed. What did Jim Carrey actually admit about what happened to him during the making of Man on the Moon? The things Jim Carrey said about losing himself. When the Jim and Andy documentary was finally released, and Jim sat down to discuss what had happened during the filming of Man on the Moon, the things he said had the specific quality of honesty that comes after long, careful processing of something genuinely frightening. He described the experience as something that happened to him as much as something he did. He said he had found himself subjugating Jim Carrey for Andy Kaufman and Tony Clifton, and that at the end of filming, he had gone looking for Jim Carrey again and having trouble finding him. He described standing at a fork in the road where he had to choose whether to follow the character into the unknown or pull back, and he chose to follow. He described his experience of having played Kaufman as analogous to looking for Jim Carrey again and having trouble finding him, which is either a poetic way of describing a difficult creative period or an admission of something more clinically concerning, depending on how charitably you interpret it. In a separate interview in 2017, he was even more direct. "There is no me, no self," he said. "Jim Carrey is gone, actually never existed, and I know that now." That statement, "Jim Carrey is gone, actually never existed," takes on a different meaning when you watch footage of the man on the set of Man on the Moon. The documentary director Chris Smith said that during filming, he reached a point where he no longer knew who Jim was. He had lost his sense of where Jim actually was in his life, because Jim had stopped being available at the frequency at which directors, producers, and colleagues access actors between takes. He described this as an opportunity, a rare glimpse of an unusually undefended person, but it also reads in retrospect as a warning sign about the specific psychological territory that Jim was exploring. Kaufman's own sister, watching footage from the production, said she believed Jim was a vessel through whom Andy had manifested. The footage also shows a moment where Jim, in character as Kaufman, offers a clear assessment of Jim Carrey. He talks about the pain hiding behind Jim's constant smile. He points to the need for approval that drives the comedy, the specific hunger for validation that had pushed Jim through his early career and into the stratosphere of fame. He was criticizing himself through the mask of another person, and the criticism was specific, accurate, and clearly coming from within the person speaking. Whether you call that self-analysis, method acting, or some kind of psychological break, it is one of the stranger and more revealing things a famous person has ever put on film about themselves, hidden inside the conceit of being someone else entirely. Jim admitted he lost himself and had trouble finding his way back. Martin Freeman watched the documentary about this process and had his own extremely direct assessment of what he saw. And then there is the question of what the whole experience did to Jim Carrey's relationship with his own celebrity, his identity, and his willingness to continue operating in the entertainment industry as he always had. What became of Jim Carrey after Man on the Moon? And is any of it connected to what he experienced on that set? What the industry said, and what Jim did next. When Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, was released in 2017, one of the most pointed responses came from Martin Freeman, who watched the documentary and reacted with the specific candor of an actor who had very different views about what the job entailed. "For me," Martin said in an interview, "and I'm genuinely sure Jim Carrey is a lovely and smart person, but it was the most self-aggrandizing, selfish, narcissistic thing I have ever seen." He said the idea that the culture would celebrate or support what Jim had done was deranged, literally deranged, and that Jim should, in his opinion, have got fired. He added that there is such a thing as pushing it, and that what he had seen was clearly that. Martin's reaction represents one pole of the documentary's critical response. The other pole is represented by the people on the Man on the Moon set who watched Jim do what he did and came away believing that the performance it produced was the result of the process and that no other process could have produced it. The film itself earned a review from Rotten Tomatoes that describes Jim as eerily dead-on in his portrayal of Andy Kaufman. His Golden Globe for the role was presented to him while he was still in the aftermath of the experience. The performance was recognized as extraordinary. The question that the documentary opens with, and that Martin articulates with characteristic sharpness, is whether the extraordinary performance justified the extraordinary behavior required to produce it, or whether the extraordinary behavior was simply extraordinary behavior, and the performance would have been just as extraordinary if Jim had been willing to answer to his own name at lunch. What happened to Jim Carrey after Man on the Moon is a question that the entertainment press has been circling around for decades without fully landing on an answer. He continued to work. The Majestic in 2001. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind in 2004, which many critics consider his finest performance and which he himself has described as a manifestation of his consciousness at that specific moment. Bruce Almighty, Lemony Snicket, a series of unfortunate events. The films kept coming through the 2000s and into the 2010s, but something in his relationship to fame, to performance, and to his own public identity had shifted. The man who had been the most kinetic and combustible comedian in American cinema in the early 90s was in different territory by the time the documentary finally came out. He had been talking in interviews for years about the meaninglessness of identity, the constructed nature of the self, and the fact that Jim Carrey was a character he had been performing rather than a person he actually was. Jim Carrey was a character I played, he has said in various forms, in various contexts, since the Man on the Moon experience. He has talked about the dissolution of ego, about looking for something beyond the need for approval that had driven his career, and about his painting as a way of existing that does not require an audience's validation to be real. The man who had built an entire professional identity around being seen and being loved, and being the person in the room who could take it furthest, has spent the years since Man on the Moon articulating why none of that is actually where meaning lives. Whether that philosophical shift is the direct result of what happened during the filming is something only Jim knows. But the timing is not unrelated. Jim disappeared into a role and came back describing himself as a character he had been playing, rather than a person who actually existed. Dave walked into the room where that was happening and felt disappointed because the person he had wanted to meet was not available. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the joke that Dave built around his encounter is now permanently attached to a story that is bigger and stranger and more troubling than the punchline suggests. So what does the full picture of this story actually tell us? The story behind the story. Dave Chappelle's anecdote about Jim Carrey is funny in the way that the best stand-up anecdotes are funny. It has a setup that builds genuine tension through specificity, a delayed revelation that reframes everything that came before it, and a punchline that lands because it connects two things that were not supposed to be connected. The problem the joke created was not a craft problem. It was a problem of what the punchline argued, and that argument ran headlong into a conversation about identity, reality, and what it means to look at someone and decide you know what they actually are, regardless of what they say about themselves. That argument is still running. It will probably run for a long time. But the Jim Carrey story, which Dave himself acknowledged, was about watching one of the greatest artists of his time immersed in one of the most challenging processes ever, carries its own weight that the punchline somewhat obscures. Jim Carrey visited the set of Man on the Moon in 1998, when he was one of the most famous people on the planet. He was guaranteed a $10 million opening weekend. He was the Mask and Ace Ventura, and The Truman Show, and a Golden Globe-winning performance that had made the entire entertainment industry understand he was capable of something beyond the rubber-faced physicality that had made him famous. He walked onto that set, made the decision to stop being Jim Carrey for the duration, and came off it months later, describing himself as having had difficulty finding his way back to who he was. Universal Pictures held footage of this process for nearly 2 decades because they were afraid of what people would think of him. Jim himself wanted the footage released immediately. but he was overruled. By the time it finally came out, in 2017, the footage confirmed everything that the rumors and the anecdotes had suggested, that what had happened on that set was categorically different from what the phrase method acting normally implies, that the people around Jim had been made genuinely uncomfortable by the behavior of both the personas he was cycling between, and that the experience had done something to Jim's relationship to his own identity that remained visible in his public statements for years afterward. Martin Freeman called it narcissistic. Kaufman's sister called it a channeling. The crew called the character Andy and waited for the day when Jim Carrey would come back. Dave Chappelle spent an afternoon with the man and came away disappointed that he never got to meet him. What Dave witnessed was not Jim Carrey acting. It was Jim Carrey in the process of discovering what happened when you push the logic of performance to its absolute limit. What do you think? Was Jim Carrey's level of commitment to the Man on the Moon role genuine artistic dedication, or did it cross a line that no one around him should have allowed him to cross? And does knowing the full story change how you hear Dave's joke? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.